Hello everyone and welcome to the second in our series of Preservica Architect series. Today we're going to have a deep dive into digital preservation and we're joined today by our CTO and founder John Tilbury and also Bert Morse, who is US based, and he's in part of my team looking after the US channels and alliances. And for those of you that have not met me before, didn't attend the first in the series, then I head up our global channels and alliances. So moving on to the agenda, we are going to finish with Q&A. If you'd like to put your questions in the question box as we go through, we will answer those at the end. I've already done the introductions, but I will hand over to John. He's going to take you through his preservation journey. He's then going to talk to you about the threats to accessing long-term digital information and how a digital preservation such as Preservica can actually mitigate against these threats. And then we'll have a look at the future about what are the other possibilities and potential challenges in this market. So I'd now like to introduce you to John.
Thank you, Maura. So I've been working in digital preservation for a very long time, as befits digital preservation itself. We started our work back in the last century with our first customer, the National Archives. And we had a fairly slow start for the first 10 years or so. And that was actually quite good because it gave us the chance to really build the basics and foundations of digital preservation in terms of defining it as a thing. We did a lot of research in those areas, a lot of European funded research projects we were members of. We won the Queen's Award for Enterprise Innovation, which means you get to go to the palace and shake the royal hand and explain to digital preservation what digital preservation is to the Queen. And if I got her to understand, hopefully I can get you to understand as well. We launched our cloud edition in 2012, and growth really took over from there, with us spinning out from our parent and getting VC funding. So within the company, there is over 2 decades of experience in this area, and that's why we like to think of ourselves as world leaders in terms of our innovation and experience in this area. And over that time, it used to be a very niche thing, understood only by specialists, but we're getting picked up now. Even Gartner have got the message. As formats change, software is retired, and hardware becomes obsolete, the data that organizations might want to keep can be lost forever. So they're getting the message that this is a thing that enterprise really need to think about. And the message is getting around in industry in general as well. So the reasons that people want to retain information, we tend to break them down into 3. To meet regulations, which means someone has told you to keep information. To mitigate other risks like legal or operational, which means that the information you keep may save you from some sort of harm in the future, like being sued or a patent being violated or some health and safety breach or something. You need the information for that. Or because the information itself has positive value that can help your organization achieve its aims. For example, repurposing some work you did earlier or not repeating it, etc. The good news is that surveys of businesses have shown that they're starting to pick that up, and that regulation and legal obligation is one of the highest drivers, and then human resources, which is kind of crosses boundaries, and various other contracts, litigation support, corporate memory, etc. These are all big drivers for why you keep information. And why you need to think about digital preservation. So that's great. We're getting those messages across. And recently, other analysts are picking up on this as well. Forrester have done a report on digital fragility, as they call it, which is the problem, essentially. And They observe that enterprise architects too need to actively plan for the retention of corporate memory by building long-term protection and preservation into their overall data governance strategies. So we will be able to distribute this report to you over the next few weeks. So get in touch with us if you'd like a copy of that. I think you'll find it very interesting. Right. Digital preservation is about reducing risk. It is about mitigating the risk of information not being findable, usable, useful, and trustable. And so these risks are many and various. The most obvious that people fixate on is media that can't be read, that is written to a device that is no longer readable either because it's damaged or because it's obsolete. It's trapped in legacy systems that are no longer supported. The metadata record is incomplete. So while you have the content itself, you have no record of why you have the content or its status. Unclear ownership and provenance. So can you be sure that hasn't been tampered with? Corrupted or deleted files. Obsolete file formats is a big one as time goes on. And that's a problem that's getting worse. That you don't have a software license or vendor support to continue reading the content. Unauthorized access, which is common to many systems, and lossy conversions, that there have been a series of conversions of the content over time, but that was a relatively ad hoc process and can't be trusted. So these are all the risks to losing data that IT has created. IT has created an opportunity with a move to digital, but it's also created a problem, and these are the sort of problems you need to think about. The interesting thing is that when the IGI in America surveyed their members, that 98% said there was a need to keep digital records for the long term because it was important. So people get that there is a need to keep, and they get there's a problem. And we need to make it easy, with your help, to make it possible for them to move forward to a digital preservation system. So there are lots of examples of failures and problems and so on, and unfortunately a lot of the corporate examples they keep very quiet about, or they're hidden in legal proceedings. But a few simple examples: a lot of people keep their home backups on CDs and DVDs. The average lifetime of a PC cut CD is about 10 years before the surface becomes oxidized. So if you go back to it and you get your data CD out to find your christening photos of your kids, you probably won't be able to read them by the time you want to embarrass them at their 18th birthday. The loss and deletion, MySpace, it's an old system now, but it had a lot of data that wasn't replicated elsewhere, and one of their servers crashed and it was all lost, and they just said, meh, hard luck. Physical damage, so paper and tapes and so on are not exempt. Iron Mountain, who have an excellent record of retaining information, but are not exempt from problems, and there have been several cases of warehouses burning down. And because they're the only physical copy of the information, and it's not replicated elsewhere, that data is effectively lost. Digital, whilst it may be fragile, is also very easy to replicate geographically, making it harder for an act of, well, one of these examples was an act of vandalism, someone trying to hide information that was held in the Iron Mountain archive. Makes it a lot harder because you can't burn down 3 data warehouses. Universal Records, very sad story if you're a music lover like me. A lot of digital master tapes were destroyed in a very famous albums in a warehouse fire, and there were no backups. They didn't think to replicate offsite. Good example of unique data that was lost. And unauthorized access, the story over recent times has been Facebook. There are many others. There's lots of data breaches out there. So these are all things that you need to think about and examples of where it went wrong, and people that have, come a cropper of not thinking through digital fragility. We have discussed this a little bit in our last presentation, but information has a life cycle. You know, you create it, and you have it has a fairly active life cycle early on, where it's been used, passed around, developed. People are changing it, things are getting approved, and then there's some period of short-term retention, and then some of it, not all of it, but some of it needs long-term retention. And that's when you start to think about alternate strategies, and some of it needs permanent strategies. So originally, you're probably using some sort of content management system to manage the initial life cycle. You then might think of a traditional enterprise archive, although that has limited search, costly retrieval, and doesn't think about the long term. And digital preservation starts to fit in at the back end of the long tail of information retention. That's where you need a preservation so that you can find things. Your archive, which grows and grows and grows and grows, you can quickly find it and quickly use it. So that's where we fit into this long-term life cycle. And there are different things at different points become interesting and become important. You mustn't forget the destroy step, actually. Not everything needs keeping forever. And so some stuff, if your retention period is 30 years, and that's the map of where the bodies are buried, at 30.00001 years, you want that to disappear. So retention is also an issue. Okay, so what should a digital preservation system provide? So this is the bulk of what I want to talk about today. And there are a stack of things that are absolutely core to mitigating the risks that I just mentioned. The first of those is safe and intelligent storage. And that can sit on top of very good quality proprietary storage systems, which are becoming more commoditized. But the key thing is that it's safe, it's geographically distributed, you have multiple copies, and it's intelligent in that you calculate checksums on every object that you keep, and you regularly check those checksums. And if something is damaged, which does happen with the volumes we're talking about here, you must accept that damage is a given, that you detect it and you self-heal because you just replicate one of the safe copies. Now, in something like Amazon S3, they keep up to 5 copies in at least 3 different data centers within the same geographical location, so over, say, a 10-kilometer radius. And so that really does fulfill that very well. But if you wanted to be doubly sure, you could make a second copy in Azure, in their archiving solutions, perhaps in their long-term solution. And then you're isolated against one of those two going up in a puff of smoke. Unlikely, of course, we think at the moment, but we have to mitigate risks for everything. And so you're replicating, you're checking the checksums, and you're self-healing. So that's the very most basic, what we call bit level preservation. You also need the information that you're retaining to be organized, and that means having it structured so that you have some sort of hierarchy, having it metadata tagged so that you know how it is described and the context, and security and so on, and audit trail, what has happened to it since it's been in the systems. And that's all part of the information organization. So say at the beginning you had minutes.doc and you put that into the safe and intelligent storage, and that file is safe. There are copies of it dotted all over North Virginia or Dublin or Singapore or whichever data service you're using. But you don't know what it is. Well, the information organization will tell you that minutes.doc is actually the draft minutes that were sent out for approval. They're not the actual minutes that were approved. There's another minutes.doc that are the actual approved minutes that were approved at the next board meeting. So we've got 2 minutes.doc. It is the information organization that tells us which is which. So we need both to make sense in the future of what that minutes.doc is. So we go to open minutes.doc, and we find that's in a was produced in a word processing package that no one knows what the heck it is. And this is where file format recycling comes in. And that is saying, well, hold on a minute, I need to keep my minutes.doc, but I also need to convert it into a version that I can read now and use now. So say minute.doc was in fact minutes.wpd, a word perfect document. You could produce an open office version of that, which you could use today. You need to keep both, but you need to constantly be looking at the file formats you've got in your collection and converting those in a controlled and certified manner to ensure that you can use them quickly. There are all sorts of ways of doing digital architecture archaeology rather, to convert things in the future. But in the meantime, the moment has gone. If it's going to take you a week to do that conversion, and the lawyer is standing in saying, well, I'm going in to see the judge in 10 minutes, I need to see that contract, then it's too late. And if you think that isn't true, the Prime Minister of Gibraltar needed to see the original signed declaration that created Gibraltar, and suddenly got the collywobbles before going into the United Nations General Assembly to speak on the matter. And he was able to access it out of Preservica. He phoned up the archivist in a panic, who sent him a link to his phone. He opened the document immediately, remembered which countries had signed it, and could call them out in the United Nations General Assembly. So that quick access can be very, very important indeed. You need to get things in. So if you have this stack that is going to preserve things for the long term, that needs to be have a way of automatically acquiring information from where it is at the moment. And that it could be just a file system, but it could be all sorts of things. It could be a Lotus Notes system that's going out of fashion, but there's still an awful lot of it around. It could be Outlook, it could be Documentum, it could be SharePoint, it could be Gmail, could be a website that you scrape with Heritage. The list is obviously endless, but the more automated that process is, and very often this is where we work with partners, is we can't think of every possible data source, and doing the ETL projects to get it out of where it is at the moment, transformed and loaded into Preservica is a big part of our work with partners. We're currently doing a project for a government organisation that is extracting 58 million files out of Lotus Notes, converting the metadata and loading it into Preservica from 1,200 Lotus Notes databases. And so that is definitely a partner project, and it's going incredibly well. The customer is delighted. And you need to be able to access things. There are very many people who say digital preservation is access, and you need to be able to access it now, and when you want it, not at some time in the future. You have to have the ability to search, do whole text searching, to do filtered searching and faceted searching on the metadata fields that you've allocated. And you need to make that available on laptops, on phones, on tablets, whatever the customer wants, so that you can get to it immediately and in a form and a format that you can use now, so that the attention spans of today's users are not challenged by having to wait a few minutes. So that is the basic across. There is a standard called the Open Archival Information System, a reference document, and this is a sort of form of this that I find a little bit more understandable, but it gives you an idea of what the basics are. However, you need to wrap that up in some modern IT. You need a security layer to make sure the right people see the right things, and that needs to have both sophisticated identity management, or rather link through to an identity management system, such as Active Directory, and it needs to have item level permissions as well. You need a workflow system to do bulk management of the content, shifting it around. There's a lot of processing goes on of stuff to, for example, transform the formats, check checksums at regular intervals, do metadata transforms and so on. And so you need a grunt system to manage that throughput. And you need an API to wrap it all up in. And again, a lot of our work with partners is about them interfacing with our system, using the API to upload and download and search and integrate. For example, some customers are doing work at the moment with public access systems. We provide a public access system, but everyone's a special snowflake. And so they want their own special system to allow to search and browse. So they might engage with a partner to develop their own front end and access our system using the API. And that's another very common way we work with partners. So that gives you an idea of the components that the digital preservation system must have. And I'm now going to highlight a few aspects of key components of this so that you can understand the complexities involved. But just to make it clear, these are the elements you should also always make sure you've got before you can claim you are a digital preservation system. You must be able to prove provenance through audit trails, authenticity using fixity, durability with self-healing storage, preservation by file format migration, disposition with retention policies and actions, privacy and confidentiality with roles, permissions and identity management, and access using search, browse and download. Without those, you're not really a digital preservation system, in my humble opinion. Okay, so let's look at the storage. I've mentioned a bit of this already. Online archival storage for timely access. Now, it's not to say that you would never use an archival storage solution such as Amazon Glacier, but the time needs to be appropriate to the need and urgency and what you're storing. You can use nearline or offline storage, and you may decide to split your collection between the two. You may say, I want to create low resolution access copies, which I'll put on immediate fast access storage, such as Amazon S3, but you can put the digital masters on Glacier, because when I need those, I'm prepared to wait. So, for example, we have a customer on one of our cloud systems that has 100 terabytes of videos that they've had digitized. The digital masters are held on Glacier, but they've created MP4 streaming editions that the public can access, and you can go and look at that, and that's on S3. So you've got 100 terabytes on Glacier and 1 terabyte on S3. So you're balancing the costs appropriately. It's a sensible thing to do. That particular collection is a collection of hillbilly music and is some of the most disturbing videos I've ever seen. I'm not going to the Appalachian Mountains. You will not get me there. But digital preservation systems shouldn't be reinventing what huge corporations can already do. AWS and Microsoft Azure are the latest examples of the leaders in terms of cloud-based or online storage. There are, of course, excellent on-premise storage as well, and you would be foolish to try and reinvent these systems. Many people did in the very early days that I mentioned back in the early part of the millennium, try and develop their own storage management systems, and a lot of money was wasted because these guys now do it off the shelf. The main thing to do is to avoid uncontrolled collections and removable media and make sure things are held centrally and managed. Removable means losable. And you should also bear in mind that we're talking about hybrid solutions. So there's no reason to say you don't keep it on one system. You could keep your primary copy, your day-to-day copy in Amazon, but have an escrow copy written to a second data store, maybe back in your building, which you keep as a redundant copy. Or you can have one in Amazon and one in Microsoft. There's no problem with that. You have one primary and one secondary, which is asynchronously updated as you make changes to the system or load stuff into the system. So that's about improving durability and reducing risk, which is what this is all about. So I want to mention a little bit about the life of a digital asset, because assets are what you might have considered as a file, but what we consider it as is an atomic piece of information. In other words, it's a bit of information which you interact with as a single entity, but you may have many different forms of that for different purposes. So, for example, a Word document is an asset, but that when you load it, you may convert it into OpenOffice just for to make it more compatible for the future. So you keep the original, you have the old one, but some assets are more complicated than that. An email has the email body, but also the attachments, and those need to be managed separately. Of course, you could leave it all in one EML file, but then what if the Word document becomes unreadable? What if that's got a WordPerfect document or an old Excel file or a Lotus 123 file attached to it that you can't read? So you have to detach those. So then your asset comprises of multiple objects. Other examples would be a 3D geometry file, which comprises some geometry, some texture files, some material files, etc. Or a tweet. The tweet body and then the images and videos attached to that tweet are separate entities, but it's still one tweet that you have to maintain, and all of your business information processes are around that single entity, but it actually comprises many files. And so those are examples of more complex digital assets that we like to think about. You need to keep all representations for all purposes in terms of chain of custody, which is incredibly important. You always must be able to trace back to the original, and you must be able to demonstrate exactly what you have done, so that you can convince a court of law, for example, that you have done all the right things at the right times to ensure that data is safe. Just to go into a little bit more detail, files have formats. One thinks as formats of being Word, Excel, etc. The National Archives, the original project we worked on with the National Archives back in the last century, was to create a database of formats. They have a database called Pronom, which we wrote back in the day, which they maintain now, I hasten to add. And it has, it says 1,500 formats, but they've just done a release. I think it's up to 1,800 formats now. With simple things like images, PDF, etc. Complex things like spreadsheets, CAD, GIS, 3D, niche instrumentation, scientific modeling. We've just been doing building out our test data set, and we're finding all sorts of different subtitle formats that we'd never heard of. It's a long, long list. And then you've got the multi-file assets I mentioned as well. And then you have to put together the best practice for these formats. And what we always talk about is doing two different things. One is keeping your digital master at the best possible format. So producing new generations of that original that, as far as you're concerned, are as good as the original, are intended to be as good as the original. They're new generations of that initial representation of the master. So if you had a video that was incredibly high detailed, but the codec was becoming unsupported, you might convert that as best as you can, another huge file, to a newer codec in the same format that was more readable, but it's still a digital master. You may also produce an access copy of those objects, which is lower resolution very often. So if you have a very high resolution scanned TIFF, you may produce a low resolution, smaller JPEG as an access copy. They're all part of the same asset, but they are different representations of that asset for different purposes. And so we maintain all of those things within our data structures. It's key to point out, increasingly we're automating this process so the customer really doesn't have to think about it very much, but we can, so long as they tell us their intent, maintain these different forms of the data. But it's something that we really set ourselves apart from most systems, and that we're constantly doing this recycling in the background to make sure things are readable and viewable. And all these different formats, creation, submission, could all be different. And you have to understand that migration can result in information degradation. It's almost impossible to do a 100% faithful migration of data. To produce a new digital master, you would hope that it's 99.99% faithful, and you would validate that it is. But that may be done on a sample basis. You can't validate every frame of a 2-hour movie. But for producing a new access copy, you'd accept a certain amount of loss. Okay, so just to summarize, you have new best quality preservation formats, which are your new masters, and you can use again, and you would have lower quality, easier to use access copies for readability. Very often it's the access copy that you make public accessible. You allow people to interact with and download. And then when they say, oh, we're going to court, I need every form you've ever had, or I need to reuse, I found this movie, these media clips, they're fantastic. I'd like to get the original because I now want to incorporate that into a movie I'm making. Okay, well, let's pull down the master copy out of the system. So different formats for different purposes. And we will help with the guidance on risk. We'll help choose for accuracy and interactivity and always retain the original. This is not a disposable, and usually you will always retain the chain of formats back to the original. Okay, you'll be glad to hear approaching the end, and we'll be taking questions in a minute, so do think up your questions. But I'd just like to try and explain or represent how digital preservation fits into other systems you will be familiar with, comparing it with a Gartner-sponsored 2 axes. So, and unless you have 2 axes, Gartner their mind goes blank. But once you've got 2 axes, they can cope with it. So along the bottom, we have the longevity of information. And here are some strategies that improve the longevity. You start with a single copy of a file. You create multiple copies, ideally in multiple geographies. You then start doing checksum validation, and then on top of those, you can add format preservation. So the further you go to the right, the more the longevity of the information is improved by those strategies. On the vertical axis, you then have the sophistication of the business processes that support that content. You start with an offline object. You then have simple access to the files, the content. You then have content with some sort of audit trail. You then have content with metadata, audit trail, and various tools to support its acquisition and distribution. You then have more sophisticated information lifecycle processes, for example, approvals and so on. And at the very top, you have very specific business logic for your business that only your business needs. So let's see where certain things fit onto this. First of all, you have a network drive. Well, that only has a single copy, but at least you can access the content. So that's where we'd say a network drive fitted. If you wanted to make that slightly more durable, you could replicate it to the cloud, for example, using OneDrive or Dropbox or one of the other technologies that allow you to do that. Now you have multiple copies, so you've improved the longevity, you've removed the risk of only having a single copy. And the content, by using one of those systems, you get an audit trail, and you can often roll back for the next month any changes that were made, etc. So you already improved the sophistication of the business processes just by replicating your stuff onto OneDrive or to one of the other systems. But then we start thinking about other corporate systems that you might use. So a cloud-based ECM such as SharePoint 365 or one of the other online systems that you can use. You have multiple copies still, but you have more sophisticated information lifecycle processes, like as I mentioned, and you can build out and customize all of those within the SharePoint infrastructure. And the most sophisticated will always be your line of business application, which has a load of business processes tuned exactly to your business, and it does exactly what you want, but is less durable because it probably has a single copy. It may be backed up, but that's about the best you're going to get. It's quite vulnerable to change because it has one single copy and a very specific set of data structures. So let's start thinking about some backup strategies. And the first thing you think about back in the day certainly might have been to put it on DVD. So that's a single copy of a very disposable media and only has offline access. So it's not really a very good story. So let's think of some other strategies you might introduce. Live backups of your network drive. Well, that's good because you have multiple copies now. They're not geographically dispersed by and large, which isn't great. And they're offline access. So those are old style backups on tapes and so on. You could invest in an enterprise archiving system, which by and large does have content access via a web browser or something. So that's improved slightly. You may copy everything to an online store such as Glacier. Well, that introduces checksum validation. So that has already improved the durability quite a lot, but it's offline. So it hasn't improved the sophistication. So here are where various systems you're familiar with will sit. Let's look at where digital preservation sits. Well, digital preservation hits as far as it's possible to the right in terms of longevity of information. And that is, there's no better in terms of making sure stuff is available long into the future. But it has some sophistication in terms of its business processes. It has content, it has metadata, it has acquisition, it has various import and export tools, but it doesn't have the level of customization and sophistication, for example, versioning, for example, approval trails, etc., that you might get in SharePoint or a line of business application. It's not intended for that. And so it has less sophisticated business processes than those systems, but it's still much better than just plain old storage, and it has the highest longevity. So I hope that helps you understand where digital preservation sits in the landscape of other systems you might be familiar with. Okay. In terms of the future of digital preservation, AI and machine learning. This is the only way the other way I get Gartner to come out of their slumber. You have to mention AI, machine learning, and blockchain. So I'm hitting triple high here. Automatically acquiring, appraising, classifying, and describing content. AI will increasingly become important on that. Blockchain will increasingly be important to make stuff more tamper evident. It doesn't stop you tampering with the content, it just makes it obvious when you have. So writing the checksums of every object onto a blockchain so that when you want to prove that you haven't changed it, you go to the blockchain, get that hash out and say, there you go, that hash hasn't changed. Distributing the policy for file format migration. I mentioned that we can help customers, but doing it at the sort of scale that we're operating at is becoming increasingly hard. So we're now looking at saying to customer, do you want to subscribe to our recommendations? If so, we'll tell you what to do. And that's what we're doing more of. Use of emulation to, if a system's some formats cannot be migrated very successfully. Most obvious which is things like databases and some more interactive content. And your option there is to pretend to be a Windows 95 machine or a Windows Server 2000 machine. Run the old application and interact with it. It's can be challenging, but there's a huge amount of work going on in this place. And my team is actively researching all of these at the moment. We're actively looking at these and seeing how these can be integrated into a live digital preservation system. And where we can, we ruthlessly copy others' work with appropriate references, because there's a lot of other clever work, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel on AI. Just use one of the online services. Blockchain, there's a lot of other research projects. So we're just looking at how we integrate into these rather than trying to reinvent them ourselves. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say on digital preservation. Digital preservation is a set of techniques and tools that allow you to maintain information for the long term. It mitigates key risks that you need to be worried about But digital preservation, with its set of techniques regarding bit level storage, format level preservation, and information management, allows you to be confident that what you've got now can be trusted, can be found, can be used, and can be useful. So thank you very much for listening today. I'm just going to mention our customers, because without them, this is not a coronavirus infection map. It's meant to be a map of customers. We have customers in lots of different domains that are really quite big. Increasingly, you see on the news, Sainsbury's, for example, just celebrated its 150th birthday. You go into a Sainsbury's store now, you'll see some big picture on the back wall of old guys in aprons and stuff. Those images come out of Preservica. There's a lot of other things, pictures of Marmite back in the day, as well as people doing some really amazing stuff. I mentioned Gibraltar, Amnesty International, war crime information, some very, very important and valuable work that we do elsewhere as well, not just the trivial ones that I mentioned. So some fascinating projects, some amazingly famous customers that trust us and we work with for many, many years. So thank you very much. I'm now going to pass back to Maura.
Great, thank you very much, John. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the second event in the series. The first one, we talked about the relevance of digital preservation, and that's available online for you to view as well on our website. And the third one we're going to do in April, and that's around architecting a Preservica active digital preservation solution. So we will be sending out invitations to that over the next week or so. There is further information on the Preservica website, but we'll move now into the questions and answers. So I think we've got a couple of questions that are starting to come up on the screen. If any of you have got questions, other questions, if you could please ask those. Just give you a second.
Just type those into the chat box
Yes.
at the bottom. Click on chat and you can type in your question there.
Okay, so we've got the first one coming up. What scale of systems are you referring to for Preservica?
So we have dealt with customers at hugely varying ranges. You know, we have local history societies with very, very small collections, incredibly important to them, but not necessarily a burden on the Amazon server network. But increasingly, the sizes are getting bigger and bigger. Typical customers are still operating at the tens of terabyte range with the millions of objects. Of course, people talk about size in terms of storage volume. Very often, it's the number of objects that is actually harder. I just helped a customer ingest 6 million death records of their state in America. And so I know where the place is not to live in. Don't go live in Detroit; it's a very dangerous place. But that was millions of scanned objects. As I mentioned, we've got a customer where we're ingesting 58 million files from Lotus Notes. The biggest instance we have is an on-premise instance, which is Family Search, which has tens of billions of objects. Running into multi-petabytes. Yale University is also a petabyte scale system as well. So it can be highly variable. The system is engineered to cope with lots of small customers and a multi-tenant environment, or a performance configuration at genuine scale. The interesting thing is that Lotus Notes couldn't handle searches across all of the databases, but since the customer has put all of the things into one Preservica instance, they can now search across the entire collection at once. And they were having some freedom of information inquiries that they were able to serve by going to Preservica, searching for things across all 58 million objects and serving up the results in an hour's work, whereas before it was 2 or 3 weeks. So the thing does scale and works very well.
Thanks, John. That's really good, pointing out some of the regulations like FOI requests that we help satisfy as well. Another question is, could you explain about lossy conversions? What does it mean, and is there a risk of information loss as such?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it's almost impossible to do 100% safe conversion, but that doesn't mean to say you don't try, so long as you make sure people are aware of the risks and you maintain the chain of custody back to the original. And sometimes it means you have to repeat because you get a better tool in the future. But if you take something like a Word 95 file and you convert that into OpenOffice, the content goes across pretty well, but you might lose the macros. So theoretically, that's not faithful. If you want it 100% faithful, you're going to have to run Windows 95 on an emulated environment. But for most purposes, just migrating it to OpenOffice is good enough. It's editable, it's usable, you can repurpose it. But keeping that chain of custody may be useful in terms of a court of law, say, for example. Conversion to PDF makes it a lot more accessible. People can use it within the web browser. They don't actually have to have Word or another word processor to be able to access the information. But you might lose your hidden text, and the information is not editable. So you've lost more there, but you've made it more useful. So long as you're clear and open about the risks and alternatives, all of the different data types have similar stories. And so long as you maintain the ability to trace back to the original, should you need to do so, that's a risk that can be managed successfully.
Okay, thank you. I've got one last question, unless anybody else types something up whilst I'm reading it out. You compared different archive and storage approaches in the longevity versus sophistication slide. Can Preservica's technology replace all of the other technologies mentioned, replace some or none of them?
Very often, that comes down to the one axis that wasn't on that diagram was, of course, cost. And so dumping it all onto a backup tape is cheaper, but more risky. Putting it all onto Glacier is cheaper, but less accessible. So the other dimension to consider is cost. Clearly, Preservica is going to be more expensive than a dark archive, but systems are written specifically for a data type. So Preservica aims to be quite generic and taking data from lots of different sources, but you might have a specific archiving application that just does SAP, and that's all it needs, all it does, and that's fine. If you just want to archive SAP transactions, then that's the only archive you need. So it depends. Preservica it has a very specific role. It can replace a lot of what's there, but you need to take other things into account.
Great, we've got another question. What level of digital preservation knowledge is needed by staff at the outset?
That's a very, very good question, and something that intimidates quite a lot of people from starting. What I would say is digital preservation systems such as Preservica, and I would say we're leading the way in this, are becoming more and more automated. So the amount of specialist knowledge that I've been discussing, really you won't need to know about unless you really want to. We can set up the migration rules for you. We can keep those up to date so that the formats are kept in the appropriate form. You just need to perhaps organize the information, acquire it from where it currently is, make sure the permissions are set, put a few logos on the public access page, and away we go. So you shouldn't need to worry about the innards of the assets and so on. I didn't mean to scare you by talking about. I was meaning to reassure you, but that's our job. That's what we do, and the rest is just plain old information shifting around the system using APIs and structures and permission settings and so on. That's the area that you need to focus your attention on and leave us to do the preservation. Unless you want to get involved in the preservation, in which case you're very welcome to come to the conferences with us, and we'll talk about it all day and all night, and we frequently do. But you don't have to.
You do, John. I won't comment any further on that and how long John spends in the bar at these events. Thank you for the final question there, Simon. Thanks for that. So we haven't got any other questions, so I'd just like to finish off by saying thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for John for giving us a deep dive into digital preservation. Two other bits I'd like to point you to for further information as well is we do regularly do live demonstrations of Preservica, and we've got one coming up next week, I believe. So you can register online for the Preservica live demo. And also we showcase some of our customers' live websites where they share their digitally preserved information on the internet. And if you go to the link when we send out the slides, you'll be able to click on that link. It is also on our website, and you can actually look and delve into some of our customers. Typically, they tend to be more of the cultural heritage organisations. Corporate organisations tend to keep things within their four walls. But do have a look, because there's some fascinating information if you're into the history and cultural heritage side of the business, or you're just interested in that. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you at the next one during April.
Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.